Welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm your co-host, John Mickton. Dan Taylor is been very busy traveling again, and he'll be back with us soon. All of us, I think, as international school educators and leaders, understand the importance of digital citizenship. And over the years, as many schools have implemented laptop programs, iPad programs, Chromebook programs, brought in digital devices, and we're spending more time online, especially in school contexts like learning management systems, example, Seesaw, Toddle, ManageBack. Many children are navigating these ecosystems. Many schools have adopted Google Workspace for Education. Other schools have adopted Office 365. So, kind of the day to day flow for many children, our students, and many educators and leaders is working in these digital environments. Now, there's, of course, the whole aspect of the skills, how to use the tools, how to function with the tools, how to leverage them. But then on top of that, what over the years has been percolating up, and in my own experience, doing a lot of work around digital citizenship in many schools and also consulting schools, has been the idea of the values, the skills, and the knowledge around the dispositions and behaviors. And that sometimes can be quite challenging. And these can vary from all kinds of different areas. You have, of course, cyber bullying, you have also privacy management, you have media literacy, you have security, you also have digital empathy, digital identity, the idea of balanced technology, all these different things that kids are juggling, that we're juggling as adults and school leaders, are part of our day to day diet. And how do we manage this? How do we curate and choreograph pedagogic experiences that are really meaningful, that make sense, are purposeful, and also can kind of weave into and kind of integrate as transdisciplinary skills where teachers don't feel like we're adding more things to their plate? And how do you make this important when so many other things are so important, like assessment, rubrics, curriculum, it might be strategic plans. And so often digital citizenship often gets shoved to a Friday afternoon or during an advisory time, and kids have 10, 15 minutes. And what we know and what we've seen, especially with social media and cell phones and smartphones coming to the fore, is that this requires much more commitment and a much more in depth approach, which is not easy because of time and space and priorities. And one of the resources that I, over the years, and I know many of you that are listening today, have always turned to is Common Sense Education. A fabulous resource. If you've never gone to it, please go to our show notes. Common Sense Education has been around for many years, and they provide a rich array of very purposeful resources, lesson plans, all kinds of very useful resources, points of reference, reflections, articles that really can support schools. And I know many schools are using the Common Sense Education digital curriculum, have adopted that. I know many parents refer to Common Sense Media, and we're going to find out the difference between the two. As for movie reviews, for app reviews, it goes on, it goes on. So I'm feeling super lucky because over the years, I've been a huge fan of Common Sense Education. I have done the certification a few times. I always refer to it. It's kind of my go to place. And I know a lot of other people that are listening, it's their go to place. But today, we are so lucky because we have Merve Lapus, who is the vice president of Common Sense Education for outreach and engagement. And he has been involved in initiatives that have reached over 90,000 schools and supported over 1.2 million educators. And we get to spend some time with Merv and really dig into kind of the topic and the organization and kind of their philosophy, what they've done, what they've learned. So, Merv, on behalf of the International Schools Podcast, a very warm welcome.
John, it's such a pleasure to be here and be here with everyone that's part of this community. You all are such an important part to the work that we do, even as an organization who started with national ambitions, knowing that we have such a wide use case and use need internationally. It's so great to be able to speak to you and speak to your colleagues around the world that have found our resources to be helpful. So, yeah, happy to be here and share what I can.
Great. So I think one of the first things is tell us common sense media, common sense education. Same
Sure.
color, kind of the same logo, same company, same organization. Kind of break the mystery for us.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think about it, you've got especially like in tech companies, you've got the big umbrella brand. Like there's Alphabet for Google, and then you've got Google, you've got
Yeah.
YouTube, you've got everyone underneath it. Same with Meta. And so with Common Sense Media, you can kind of think of it similarly to that. So as an organization, our whole focus really is to rate, educate, and advocate for kids and families when it comes to media and technology. So Common Sense Media really looks at our evaluation for media and tech through the context of parents, caregivers, and families. And then our education work through Common Sense Education is really focused towards working with educators and the broad community that educators support, from kids to the educators themselves, the administrators, school boards, and then the families and the communities that are a part of them. And then on our advocacy work, that's where we do a lot of work in the policy space. We do a lot of work in international politics, spending actually quite a bit of time in Europe, doing things with the United Nations and others when we first looked at those big privacy um, uh, uh, policies that were passed that have become adopted across the world. I mean, that's a lot of common sense actually in those spaces, having those conversations with a lot of these international leaders. So when it comes to media and tech, we are very kid partisan. And then the best way that we can really focus on how to do it is making sure that we can support those that are supporting kids.
Yeah, and that's great. And I just think it's so interesting how you're making the connection with Europe and some of the regulations, and how those regulations. I know California has adopted something very similar to the GDPR, and now the
That's correct.
EU has the AI Act. One of our guests, Clara Hawking, was sharing about that. So it's just wonderful to see that connection. Now, you are a nonprofit. Am I correct in saying that?
That's correct. We are a nonprofit organization, and then in Europe, and especially out of our office that we have coming out of the UK, we are recognized as a charity in that space, as well as other countries. But in the US, we are a nonprofit organization.
And so when at the very beginning, and I know you've been involved in this space for many years, why common sense education? How did this happen? Is it just one day somebody said, "Oh, this is not good. We need to create resources." I'm just curious. Usually there is a kind of an
Yeah.
engaging story with the founder. Maybe you can enlighten us.
Yeah, there is an origin story to everything. I would say, so we were established in 2003, and this was kind of the rise of, I mean, media and technology, but especially media in general, was just a big part of the way, of the discussions that kids and that families especially were having, because just of all the television being watched and America Online and the internet starting to really kind of develop and grow, and then we got smartphones, right? And then social media. And as these things ramped up, we heard more and more from the families that were using common sense media that we really wish that we could get more of this information out to families, and maybe if we can do it through schools, because schools are such a great avenue to working with families, especially families that don't know who we are as an organization. They don't come to the website. Again, back then you went to websites to find information. It didn't find you in every place you're at now. Um, so as we started working with schools, they were really asking us, do you have information you can give us that we can then give to families? And so Common Sense Education initially was a program focused on providing resources to schools specifically about educating families on these topics. And that
Ah,
first year, we said, well, you know what? If we can get like 300 schools really interested in this, this would be successful for us. And by the end of the year, we had well over 3,000 schools wanting our content to be able to get to their families.
wow.
And then very quickly, it turned into, this stuff is so important. Our kids are starting to use technology or being online. Why wouldn't we try to get them to start thinking about these things now? And then that's when I started with the organization 14 years ago, and that's when we first introduced our first curriculum. Was 14 years ago, and that the piloting of that was a lot. It was a lot of new, fresh content and a lot of kind of media literacy and digital literacy research that kind of went into that. And here we are now. So it's been um, a growth experience to kind of recognize that when we first started, it was just about getting parents, and then it was about providing resources to schools so that they can teach their kids. And then now we're recognizing that schools are really looking for full wraparound resources and needs. How do we build up our administrators, our educators, be able to feel confident in delivering this kind of content to our kids and really developing a culture of these kinds of conversations across our schools? And then how do we continue to really navigate this space with our parents, where we hope these kids are going to be or these students are hopefully reinforcing these skills that we are talking about or that we're providing them, and reinforcing them and transferring them into the spaces where they're back at home, because our students and our little ones, outside of school, are also still using a lot of media and technology.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting you bringing that up is, how do you, by creating these spaces of learning and understandings of these different issues tied to digital life, how those skills and those dispositions then are transferable into the real life. And I think that's so important. And I think one thing that I have found through using your different resources, they really make that nice connection, because so often the digital life that kids are engaging with, it's far more vibrant outside of school than in school.
Yeah.
And so there sometimes feels a bit of a disconnect. Kids, I often talking to many kids, they're like, I almost have to like dress down for school, because while when I'm at home, I'm far more nimble and uh, living in many different digital ecosystems. You talked about when you first came in, you start doing research, as you develop this curriculum. So what were your kind of points of reference? How were you doing this research? And were you working with specific schools? Were you working with
Yeah.
universities? What was kind of the dynamic to kind of get this baseline?
Sure. So we initially started our work with Dr. Howard Gardner out of the Good Play Project at the Harvard School of Education, and he's famously known for his theory of multiple learning and thinking theories. Is just kids learn differently. Every kid has a different way, whether it's visual or auditory or tactile. And these theories of multiple modes of learning were a big part of the Good Play Project in looking at essentially how are kids learning and how are they affected and impacted by the things in their lives. And in that work with the Good Play Project, started really looking at the impact of media and technology as it was ramping up in kids, especially as we started seeing that more and more kids were being exposed to television at such young ages, right? Um, Kids were, and you'll hear it from the pediatrics associations or different medical forums, like we really shouldn't have our kids on screens too early, and they shouldn't be spending more than X amount of time. And then we come into the realities of, in order to make dinner, I need my kid to be occupied, and so what's that a time of affordance that I can really allow for them? And then we start to really recognize, well, it's not just the time or the amount of time, but the quality of time. What is your screen time being spent on? Is it active? Is it high quality? And so that's why, as an organization, we continue to really look really thoughtfully at the impact of traditional media, whether it's television or now streaming to YouTube and all these other platforms, because the impact of the quality of the content and how it informs us as consumers, informs our kids, is incredibly important. And then you've got that ramped up experience of this now all following you and presenting itself through social media, through other active platforms and tools that are a part of the way that we live our daily life. So being able to really navigate these are the realities, understand them. Let's make some, hopefully, develop the agency to make some good decisions on how we use them. And those agencies really require some real skills and recognition around like our cultural context or our personal context for what it means to us. And then how do we leverage that then to make the right decisions? But how do we do so then in a consistent way? And oftentimes it's going to be either strong role modeling from our own parents and families who are also still struggling with understanding what all of these things are, or it's going to be in our educational environments where we have a lot of the learning already happening for our kids.
I like the way you described this between this balance between these different tensions. And I'm wondering, when you started 14 years ago, the digital media landscape was very different than today, where you now
Yeah.
have large language models and avatars and even now AI agents coming out. how have you kind of kept nimble? Are you always working with different universities and research centers, or are you also working with schools? How often are you connecting with kids and teachers in your development and as you enrich in the programs that you provide?
Yeah, so we have a number of different universities that we've done a lot of work with here in the U.S. We also are closely connected to the Center for Digital Thriving, which is now a very specific offshoot from the Good Play Project at the Harvard School of Education that's really focused on the impacts of media on kids. And so the CDT, not only do they look at that, but they're really looking at um, the impact of this use really through behavioral psychology. And so now, how do we use clinical methods potentially in day-to-day instruction, and how do we do that through practice and real informed insight to what kids are feeling? One of the, I would say, the most like recent ones, we just released a new research report just about I'd say a month ago, just under a month ago, called "Unpacking Grind Culture in American Teens," which essentially is supposed to focus on pressure, burnout, and the role of social media as it plays in there. And as we
Mm,
looked at that research with them, we found that 81% of teens feel at least some kind of negative pressure, right, with the experience that they have. And 27% of them are feeling burnout because of all the things they just feel like they have to think about, the anxiety of being connected, of the expectations they have on them now, or perceived expectations they have on them to be a son, a daughter, a child, a student, a leader. There's all these expectations they're feeling, and how does that then impact the way that they present themselves, take care of themselves, think about themselves, right? Because social media is playing this dual role now, where it's helping them to mitigate, some, and it amplifies for others. And
yeah.
that's only part of the broader story, because it really does include kind of like, how do we then look at the role of adults and peers in the lives that are contributing to these pressures, in addition, of course, to social, financial, and personal circumstances.
It's kind of amazing to think based on that report that you're highlighting these areas, the kind of idea of anxiety, burnout, and the pressures that, young people that are, I assume, between 13 and 18. And
Hmm.
to think also adults often are feeling the same. But as
100%.
adults, we maybe have greater capacity, we have more experience, maybe more wisdom. When you talk about this, you're a US based organization.
Yeah,
But something that I think I've always appreciated, I feel like you have a good sense of multiculturalism. Is that just innate because you're in San Francisco, you're in California, that's a very rich multicultural environment? Or are you also mindful that in an international school context or international context, the dynamics might be the same? Because often I know, and I'm curious how you would answer this, when I present some of the research to parents in workshops, they're like, oh, it's again American research. Is there anything from Europe or Asia? How would you address a parent that if they're coming up with that pushback? And it's not because I don't agree with your research or don't think it's
yeah,
amazing, but I know often, when you're in an international context, always delivering American centric or Anglophone centric
sure.
resources, parents are like, well, don't you have anything else?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, so when we conduct the research itself, we make sure that there's a really cross-sectional, representative community that is a part of that research. So it doesn't just feel like one type of community within the U.S. context, right? We've got such diverse communities here in the
Yeah,
U.S.
you do.
We're talking about like racial backgrounds, but then we're also talking around gender-identified backgrounds for individuals, and then how do we oversample intentionally to really get a sense of how do Black and Brown kids look at this tool differently in their own lived experiences? How do LGBTQ plus kids potentially use this tool differently versus the kind of the general population? And so when we then think about those that data, we try to provide a foundational place for everyone to think critically then about, where do I play a role in this? Where do I fit in this? So the intention isn't to say this is how it is. The intention is to get you to thinking like, kids are spending 18 hours a day on in this age range. Where are they spending it? Let me ask my kid, like, how does this sound for you? Oh, well, that's not me, but I know people like that. So it may not be that it's a one to one, but you'll find that you're in that continuum of that space, and it's about getting you to think about the context in comparison with intention, because it is about you and your community, your kids, your family, right? This is just hopefully a baseline to kind of look at. Here's what we see. I mean, the reality is, yeah, when we do work over in the UK, we do also work with them to make sure that our content is um, kind of not necessarily recreated, but co-created in a way that then takes into account their their context for their own community. So it's not just the S's and the Zetas, or the fact that when I say kids, they something like, oh, you're talking about little people, like children, because kids is different over there as a term. So even just things like that we can make sure that that language can be adjusted. And we've got a number of countries who come back and say, hey, we have educators and we love your stuff. We would love to do all the translations and make sure that everything
Oh,
is all
fantastic.
set and here available. So like the as an example, the Iceland as a country came to us and said, we've already recreated it all. We're re-recording the videos, like with kids' voices over your teens' voices. Um, is that okay? Like, can we really do this and make it available for all of our educators? And so we worked with them to make sure that that's something that they're available to do. They had funding to get internal resources to get it all done, and so we helped to support them to get those things done. So yeah, so as much as we can do to make those types of things available, we try.
Yeah. So I assume in the case of Iceland, it would be a case where Iceland took a video that they found on the Common Sense Education website, and then they translated. Is everything that you do Creative Commons share alike?
Yeah, all of our resources on our site as it stands right now are Creative Commons. So
Okay.
you're able to take them and make those adaptations as needed, especially if you keep them within the frameworks of the Creative Commons.
Yeah, and you're not going to go and sell them, etc. I'm
Correct.
wondering, when you talked about in your context, you looked at different communities and different
Hmm.
multicultural groups, and you also explained kind of if I'm abroad and I'm talking to my 17-year-old, they might be able to make that connection, but then also add to their context. Are you finding different cultural groups are dealing with media differently? Or is media and smartphones kind of agnostic and all teens are dealing with it in the same way and being impacted the same way? Or is it socioeconomic? Is it depending not on culture, but about if you're very wealthy, you're middle class, or maybe you're more working class? And I hate even doing that, but that's the best way I can describe that at this
It is a
time.
reality, yeah, because to get access to the best resources and tools or the most updated ones, there's a cost for that. And so there's exposure for, I would say it's become very ubiquitous, even with LLMs. Anyone can access these LLMs now, but if you want the most updated versions of it, you're paying, right? And so communities with means and with opportunity, they will be able to afford being able to pay those premiums and gain access to a smarter, faster version of that tool. Whereas most communities, as long as they got access to a smartphone or a Chromebook for the most part, or any other kind of device, they can gain access to these things because these platforms have made it easy for them to become really kind of agnostic and where they're accessible. But I would say the what's missing is the opportunity of really being able to look at depth of content, or certain ways that the content might be uh, reframed, recreated, so that it allows for you to do more with that content in terms of like visualization or voice. Like these new tools that are out there, you're paying for them, or you're getting a very small version of it. And so they're I would say that as we think about these contexts, then there's opportunity for it, but the way that they're being accessed, it may not be through the same app or even the full functionality within that, because that particular country may have very strict regulations or limitations to those tools that they can use. But the pressures in terms of how they feel connected to it, the grind feel, like that sounds like a very American term. Um, but the pressure, anxiety, connection to feeling like, in many other countries, they've got these national tests that they have to study for, and they all take at the same time. That's that's the grind culture for them.
Yeah,
And then they've
yeah,
got their connection to their friends, and I'm supposed to meet up with them, and like that same type of pressure exists regardless of where you're at. It's
yeah.
just being defined or termed maybe a little differently.
It's amazing to think pressure is just so agnostic. It hits everybody, and that's and what's interesting is that as you are describing all this, I imagine in your 14 years and since the organization was founded in 2003, the landscape has changed so much. It's almost like sometimes when I think of my own beginnings in this space was in 1993. I was in Tanzania, Africa, and I
Hmm.
remember with a colleague we actually dug a trench to put a phone line so we could have internet. I mean those kind of things.
Yeah, and it's
And
still the
others.
reality for a lot of communities where
Thank
they're
you.
dial
Thank
up.
you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That's really important because digital equity is sometimes we forget. And that's still an issue for many, many people around the world and many students and educators. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
What for you has been the biggest surprise in the last 14 years?
So I would say when we first did this work, the reality is this is not considered core curriculum, right? The content that we create and provide, it's not math, it's not social studies, history or language arts. It's seen as secondary, but it's and typically it was led by individuals like yourself, those lone individuals who said, "This is important stuff. I'm going to start teaching these things to my kids in my own classroom." Or if I'm a library, oftentimes for here in the States, and as well as in others, it's the librarians or counselors who are already kind of trained around talking about these types of issues, who have adopted this kind of content to then expand the way that they're working with the kids that are coming through their offices or their learning spaces that they have access to. We've now very much come to a place where teaching digital literacy, media literacy, digital citizenship are becoming like policies that are coming down into state legislation or into legislation in countries where it would be remiss of us not to address these things and teach these things with our kids if we're going to expect them to be the next generation that's going to lead our society. We must address these important topics and issues. And it can't just be one teacher doing it in one classroom at one school. We do need to recognize that these are skills that need to be reinforced, not necessarily taught in every classroom, but reinforced in every classroom. So, what is the opportunity in doing so, and what accountabilities are then in place to allow for schools and communities to be able to actually make it a priority? And I think that's the big shift that I've seen is got that individual educator kind of doing it alone. In many cases, are still doing it alone, but they've got all of the green light to find other areas to be able to support that work because now we've got administrators and other regulations or policies that are informing criteria for that school to complete this kind of work. So now they've got a few less hurdles to jump, still doing it on their own. Uh, Hopefully, and we do see a growing number of educators that are really starting to embrace, I need this for me. So how do I learn more about these things for me so I can be a better role model and steward of how we talk about these things? And how could I potentially bring some of these conversations in the classroom? Because my kids want to talk about it. So how does this help support when I talk about math and fractions, or when I talk about science and health, and talk about like human health alongside with and mental health, right? There are ways to bring these conversations in really thoughtfully to existing curricula, and I think that's the big shift that we're starting to see, and it's going to take some time, but it's really powerful to see the intentionality of building the conversations in.
Yeah, and I can definitely feel, having been the lone individual with a few other colleagues, and I know there are many people that I greatly respect that are doing amazing work out there. I feel they've been lone soldiers in many
Yeah,
ways, uh, and it's been very frustrating. So my question, do we need a John Hyatt book to tell us kids are all depressed because of smartphones for suddenly policy to come about? Because a smartphone, I mean, if we think many of these things, why, Merv, has it taken so long? What was it in schools, the way schools are designed, uh,
yeah,
that this didn't happen before? Because, one-to-one laptop programs are kind of old school. I mean, everybody's had one. Some people are actually going backwards and getting
yeah,
rid of them. We've got the whole smartphone issue in schools and ban, etc. But
yeah,
one thing that I've often, and I feel personally from my different experiences working with schools, is this always resonates with school leaders and educators. Oh, yeah, digital citizenship is important. Yeah,
Sure.
don't have time to do it in my class. So we're going to have to find some little block somewhere. Why was that? And what maybe is changing?
Yeah, so I would say that there was this kind of, especially as you're bringing up like the phone. Why did it take Jonathan Haidt's book to get everyone to start thinking about maybe we shouldn't have cell phones in the classroom? And there is a real connection to what we were talking about earlier, just around having access to reliable, connections is one. But there was that digital divide, and then from there became this app gap, essentially, who has access to the best resources. So now as we started really focusing on the divide and getting connectivity to all schools, then we had this app gap, which is focused on how do we get the best tools and the tools that are actually used well versus the ones that aren't, and it's just really good marketing. That was a whole thing, just trying to figure out, especially when tablets were a big thing before we went into traditional more like Chromebooks and computers, depending again. And the tablets are still a big thing, depending on the school and the community where they're looking at tablets are easier for our younger learners to be able to use and navigate and
Mhm.
play. So then it's like, what are the actual good tools? So we're not wasting the time that they're actually spending on them that we could actually believe in. So like that's part of the work that we do. How do we make strong recommendations? So if you're going to use these tools for what you're trying to achieve, here are the tools that you can use for that. And then there was the big, we're at this kind of media literacy lift, or I call a lit rift, the literacy rift, understanding the impact and the long term realities of, or the long term impact of the way that we're using these tools and how it's affecting us, how it's affecting the mental health of ourselves, but especially our kids. And how do we feel empowered to be able to recognize these are all really good things? These are things that don't work for me. How can we actually see policy come to change? Um, how these tools are potentially misusing us or our information. So there is a big rift in understanding in this literacy rift of not just how to use the tool, but recognizing the impacts of the way that the tool is created, its intention, and how you could really kind of work through that. But in addition to that, we then had lockdown. So when lockdown and COVID happened, a lot of schools were one to one, but at least in the US, it wasn't a normal thing yet. We still had what we called cows, computers on wheels, that were being shared across classrooms, or we had a handful of computers in the back. So kids were exposed to them, whether they were in the back of the classroom or in a computer lab. But during lockdown, it made every school necessity, and that's where a lot of our emergency funds went to. Every kid needed to be connected because everyone was at school for at least a year at home, right? And some even extended. And then, so even pause there. Before lockdown, because we didn't have devices available for every child, cell phones became the opportunity of providing a personal device to help you access content because there weren't enough computers in the classroom. And so in many districts, they were allowing for personal devices to come in because, as an equity recognition, kids knew how to use the tool already. They just needed guidance to the right resource that they were using in the classroom so that it can become part of a learning tool. And then it also became an issue of safety. And so those conversations around having that around became an issue of safety. And that now, fast forward, we actually have all the devices for every kid. So since we have all the devices for every kid, we don't need them to have a personal device. If anything, that personal device is now a nuisance because kids are not paying attention in class, and they've got more focus on those devices, and it's pinging them, thousands of times a day. And we did a research project last year where we followed kids, and we saw that on average, kids were having at least 256 notifications sent to them while they were at school, and in some cases had an extreme of over 1,000 notifications. So you wonder, why are these phones potentially taking their attention, and how are they becoming a nuisance in the classroom? So then the book comes out. It says these are actually a distraction, and the conversation is then, yes, these should be removed. We've been feeling this for a long time, and so I think that's just kind of what is that origin story of this whole ramp up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
kind of started in that direction, um, and now they've allowed for them to be in many of these spaces, but just recognizing the impact of them in these spaces, and if we can really find a way to kind of meet the ultimate goal. The one, I think the phone bans are a great start. I don't think they're the answer, because a lot of things you talk about, John, and your work, and especially when you talk about digital citizenship, removing the phone for the 7, 8 hours that they're in school just delays what they're feeling until they get home, and then they jump all in, whether
Yeah.
they're walking home or
Yeah.
on a bus,
Yeah.
or driving. So it hasn't changed the way their relationship
Yeah.
with the device
It's
or
just
the
put it on
platform.
hold
It's
temporarily. It's like
just
a
delayed it.
pause. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if these
Yeah.
conversations around media literacy, digital citizenship, if these aren't a part of that strategy, then we're just delaying the reality. We're not changing or shifting what we're trying to actually do in regards to addressing mental health of our kids and media and technology.
And I think that's a really important point is that, as you're saying, you're trying to address mental health and media literacy, and how sometimes, schools, because of maybe strap time, curriculum focus, or think, oh, we're just going to shut this down. Chat GPT, that happened with quite a few.
Yep.
I know New York did that, and then other schools were doing that.
Then
And
turn
there was
right back
all,
around. You're like,
yeah,
well,
yeah.
actually,
Yeah.
yeah,
So I'm wondering, here we are in the dawn of a new age, and I know that AI has been around for decades and decades, but really I would say in the last 2 years, and now we're seeing, Magic School, EduI, there are all these apps coming out, and
yeah,
teachers are suddenly jumping on and doing assessments and lesson planning and writing emails back to parents and whatever it might be. Do you think from our experiences in the past in this journey, so let's say from 2003 when your organization began and
yeah.
today, have we gotten smarter? Do you think we're better poised to engage with the challenges that AI bring to kids? I just the other day we're talking to a group of 11-year-olds, and out of I had 100 over a few days. 72% have an AI assistant that they rely on daily.
Mm.
And they didn't call it, they either she or he, but
Hmm.
there was definitely, you got a sense that they had a relationship. They relied on it. They thought it was super helpful. They kind of
Sure.
liked it. Sometimes they got annoyed with it. But you
Yeah.
could see all these emotions coming through as they were describing. We were talking about digital security, but we were also talking about what does it mean when you keep sharing your voice and everything that you do in your house, that Amazon Echo or whatever you decide to use is actually listening to a lot of things depending on the privacy settings and the
Yeah.
agreements. Do you think that today we're better poised? We're wiser, we're more prepared, better armed in the sense of having the strategies and toolkits now to engage with AI, or are we still have places to grow and learn?
So there's a lot here in that question, John.
I
I would
know, I
say,
know, I know.
yeah,
I always do this to our guests.
yeah, yeah. So I would say there's a few different like fronts to have to address here. I think one of them is collectively, educators, schools, and even just the community at large do not want to feel like we didn't address this fast enough in the way that we didn't address social media and its impact on our kids fast enough. So there's that fear of wanting to jump in now. I think there is a reality of we are now hearing a lot about, like you mentioned earlier, generative AI in schools. AI has been around for years, right? Decades now, and we're living with it and using it in our day to day. But this new type of AI is starting to kind of get folks a little riled up, either with excitement or concern, especially in classroom. And so when we think about generative AI, the big conversation is still primarily around academic integrity, right? But you mentioned things earlier that is incredibly important because it's not just about academic integrity for our kids. If anything, the research that we did, now I think 3 months old, 3 months ago, showed that 70% of teens have already used some type of generative AI tool, including chatbots, or image generators or something to provide those results. And they're far more apt to try and use these tools before their parents, and in many ways also their own educators. So our kids are getting exposed to this tool pretty fast, and they're really excited about that idea. Then, as we think about the education landscape, we know that administrators and tech leads who are kind of talking about these issues are very heightened in the conversation because they, again, the things mentioned beforehand of we don't want to miss something we didn't do with social media, we need to get ahead of it. There's also so much great opportunity here in terms of like administrative supports that it can do for our teachers, really provide them the resources that they need or the time that they need to do the things that they want to do, and actually with more focus. So there's this big conversation that we're hearing on kind of those administrative levels and tech lead levels that sound like AI, generative AI especially, is kind of like the talk of the current future of what to do. And they're developing and having these big conversations. But when you get down to the classroom level, most educators, they hear about it, they're beginning to understand what it is, but they are nowhere ready or interested in wanting to bring generative AI in any real way into their classrooms quite yet. I think the closest place that we're getting to is the experience of generative AI used through the teacher context or the administrative needs of a teacher, which is why you mentioned things like Magic School and other tools that are focused on the educator. Because a lot of these tools actually also aren't appropriate for kids, like just based on their terms of use under 13, and many others that are highly publicized as K-12 in their privacy terms of use, it's under 17, but they market it as K-12 because there are many privacy implications that have to be considered in how they're being shared, informed, and what they're generating, and they don't pass those terms. I actually ran into that in a couple different conferences where I was questioning like their privacy, um, practices, and they were marketing it to K-12, but clearly in their own tool it said under 17 should not be using this tool, and the people on the floor had no idea, but they were
Wow.
using the talking points of communicating out this is a K-12 tool because the goal is AI is huge. Let's educators and administrators especially are on heightened interest. Let's get it out there. Let's grow. It is a highly valuable, profitable technology, and
It
so
is. It is. It's
I think
interesting
it
because that's
is.
almost reflecting what OpenAI and Claude and all these companies are doing. They realize there's a lot of money in it, and it's almost reflected in these ed tech companies that are suddenly saying, well, let's just say we've got AI in our tool and everybody's going to be interested.
It is on the roadmap for every single company, organization, everyone,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. You're
Especially these tools.
Yeah, and if you don't have it, then you're kind of passé.
You're
It's
behind.
thank you for the way you answered my horribly complicated question. You get a medal, and I so appreciate that. And I think it's really interesting how you broke that down and kind of into those three areas. Now, what about something like Snapchat? You're seeing
Mhm.
certain of the kid friendly. TikTok is a kid friendly, no, but a lot of kids are on it. Instagram,
Yeah.
you're starting to see those AI tools. What are you noticing? Are you noticing that dynamics in relationships from, I don't know if you've
Oh,
done any
yes.
research, has anything really shifted? Are you noticing something here that kids are actually maybe more comfortable dealing? There was the whole issue with character AI and the poor
Totally.
young person that killed themselves, and kind of being able to not define the reality that this is actually a machine doing tokens and math, but it's not an emotional, empathetic thing. What is
Yeah.
your thoughts on that?
I'm glad you brought that up. Very specific in recognition of it is not an emotional, empathetic thing. Because the reality is these are being built into systems, social media platforms our kids are readily on. And we all know already the impact of social media, something that was meant to make you more social, is actually becoming more isolating for kids. They're measuring themselves against others online. It's making them feel like they're not as good. And the whole challenge that we've run into with social media that we're trying to prevent now with generative AI, essentially, it is supercharging the same issues for our kids and now representing them in ways that actually make it more harmful. Which is why our AI literacy lessons have very specific lessons that are on chatbots and those relationships, because these chatbots, these tools, as much as they feel like you're having a conversation, they don't know right from wrong, and they also don't judge you. And so if I'm a child who has nowhere to go, or I don't feel connected to people that I can trust, or my parents just don't understand me, but I need to get this out, they start having these conversations with a chatbot who doesn't know right from wrong and will not judge them, which is one of the reasons that they're okay with this, because I don't feel judged when I ask these questions. They're getting information, and that information feels real because now it's starting to come from a realistic sounding voice. You can I make it sound relatively close to Scarlett Johansson talking back to you, even though I know they've all, like, especially OpenAI, like it's not her, it's someone else. But there's all these different voices, and you can choose the kind of voice that resonates with you, and you can have them change the way in which they respond to you in terms of tone that they've adapted. And so now you've got a a form of communicating that feels right and you feel comfortable and you're not being judged, it's of course going to come to a point where it's going to feel real and authentic, even though it is completely computer generated and has no idea what it's saying to you, being positive or negative. Their affirmations are, "Oh, you keep engaging, then I'll keep pulling, and I'll keep tuning it down to the things that I think you want from me." But it doesn't know that because it doesn't know emotion. So that is problematic if that becomes the constant for kids who are starting to feel disconnected, don't have really strong relationships, and that becomes their strongest relationship.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you say, as they're disconnected and this becomes their strongest relationship. I had one student, quite young. I said, why do you guys like your AI assistants? And one said, oh, I love her because she's always in a good mood and she never screams at me.
Yeah,
And I said, "Oh, really? That's interesting." She never when she's not happy, she says, "She's always happy." My mommy's not always happy, and sometimes she screams at me, and I'm thinking,
so,
"Okay, there you
yeah,
go."
yeah. So I completely
Wonderful.
understand that. I
Yeah.
totally understand that. Yeah,
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 yeah. And what's interesting, and I think, everything that you've been saying, and thank you, is really in many ways being replicated for us adults. We know that Replica is an example, millions of users. We ourselves, we depend on Siri in the car, we have the Navsat.
yeah,
So many of these things and conversations that you're focusing on really are part of the journey that we ourselves maybe started as adults, depending how
yeah,
old you are, or my kids that are young adults. So I think there's so much richness in what you have done and what you curate. And I know that I just am doing a series of AI workshops for parents, and your resource was so well received. People were like, oh, this is so helpful. Why didn't I know about this? And so we're coming to the end of this podcast, but I have already told you this because we've had other conversations. I personally want to thank you, and I'm sure on behalf of some other listeners, thank you for what your organization has done over the years. Because for many of us that were alone or in international school settings, sometimes we can't get resources. There are all kinds of issues, just the ease and the capacity that we could tap into. And I know a lot of people do the Common Sense Educator certification, and some schools have also done the Common Sense School. So there are just so many things that you've laid out. What's next, Merv? What is your big worry? What is your big like? Oh, we need to get onto this.
yeah. Well, I think our big thing right now is we want to continue to make our content and our resources more accessible for all educators. And the reality is, like you mentioned this at the top of the cast, you know, time is always an issue. And so as we are rethinking um, how we create the next generation of resources, we want to make sure that we're able to address all these complex topics that we've been addressing and continue to adapt into as we grow into more chatbot conversations and AI, continue around the social emotional wellness and mental health recognition within these lessons. But we are going to be rethinking how the lessons are shortened and more in thoughtful activities that can then be stacked and connected. So 15-minute, 20-minute lessons that anyone can really fit in when you've got a moment you want to talk about a topic that is in the zeitgeist of the community right now. And how do you do it in a way that is approachable so that it is a discussion to go deeper? And that could be the place to start. And then that there's another lesson you can bring in that's another 15 or 20-minute lesson. And you can just stack them. And if the conversation keeps going, you're like, I've got more time. The kids want to keep going. Oh, I'll take that next lesson. And then you can continue on. So really providing our tools in a way that are accessible in the sense that they're there and they're free and they're available, but how do we get them available onto your own learning management system so that they're right into your own platforms? That's one of my big priorities. And then recreating them in a way that are short, activity based, video based, that anyone can take and really have these types of discussions and help foster kind of more of a, a communal conversation around these issues, and not have to just rely on the John Micktons of the world that we don't all have in our schools, right? So that's what I'm building toward right now. And I think the big thing then is how do we even potentially bring this into the platforms themselves? So as we start to have more discussions with the open AIs, the Googles, the Anthropics of the world, what can we be doing so that as you develop forward, these are developed with our kids and our school communities in mind, recognizing that you do have the bigger platform, but let's talk about the school's platform.
And I think what I really like and I'm hearing is this idea of making them bite-sized 15, 20 minutes, because often teachers, like you say, they might be doing a unit on science or geography or whatever, an
Mhm.
inquiry into maybe some explorers or looking at gender equality, whatever. And just having 15, 20 minutes, I think so often what happens is for a lot of teachers is like, well, I don't really have time to go and plan all this. And kind of
Totally.
almost cherry picking things and saying, quick, I can insert that. That really resonates. And also with the platforms, because I know many teachers work within different platforms and having the lessons. And some platforms are starting to, I know Seesaw is starting to do some things, and
Yeah.
some of the others, absolutely. Merv, before we wrap up, what for you, you are surrounded by this, you work, you talk to thousands of educators and you travel the world and you work with schools. How do you keep so positive?
Well, I've got 2 young ones of my own. They're, 12 and 14, soon to be 14, and I see them in the classrooms that I walk into, from, what they could be to just getting started, and I think that's what keeps me really connected to the work is because I'm connected as a parent, as a community member, as a father, and it allows for me to really recognize what can I do so that educators, so that parents, so that these communities can feel that they've got a stake in the game of helping to direct how these play a role in the lives of our kids and families. So that keeps me really excited. That and I love technology. I'm kind of a tech nerd, so I'm all about it. So if I can find ways to have tech be good and really continue to leverage it in ways that allows me to uh, you know, keep the scope and scale of the work that I do. These are things I embrace. And then
Fantastic.
I pause it and I focus on them. What do you need? What do I need to do to teach you something important today? Because these are all skills that are going to be transferable in your adult life. That includes
Exactly.
technology as well as offline.
Yeah, and I think that's so important what you just said, these skills, these dispositions, and these values and attitudes, and even the knowledge. These are thing in the workplace. We know how people's, in Instagram and even in work emails and things, there's all kinds
Yeah.
of, stuff that you would say that's not very digital citizenship like. So absolutely. I want to remind our audience that you can go to the show notes and you can connect with Merv. I'm sure if you reach out to him, he'd be very happy to engage in a conversation. There's some links, but I think really the resources you're very familiar with, Common Sense Education. And if you have never been there, do spend some time. Merv, we always do this before we wrap up is what is something you would like to invite educators and school leaders to consider here as now we are moving into the age away from large language models, but to AI agents,
Hmm.
deep fakes. It's kind of everything is supercharged and super complex. What are two things or one thing that you would like to just share out to our community of listeners?
Also, I recognize that we're all likely in different places, different spaces in terms of how we think about the role that these can play in our own lives. But I would say largely our kids are hearing about these things and are interested and curious about these things. So you don't have to know how to do everything, but you should have the natural curiosity to learn a little bit more about them so that you can have a discussion or at least be more aware of what your kids are doing or might be interested in. Because that allows us to be good role models. And if we can role model how we use a tool, how it leverages us for leverages our work, or is a great opportunity for civic or social engagement in a way that we want to role model, and then put those into practice so that our kids can see it, replicate that, and be good stewards themselves. That is one of the best things we can do. If you don't have the time to go all in and go deep and teach lessons, reinforce it in the way that you use them yourselves.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So again, show notes and Merve Lapus from Common Sense Education. Just to remind our audience, thank you. We've had a real increase in people subscribing, so we are deeply grateful that you find these conversations rich and worthy to listen to for 45 minutes on your device. Again, if you like conversations like this and having guests like we have today, Don't forget to go to your favorite podcast area and just if you can click on a star and share a review, that really helps us also get the attention of other guests that want to come here and share their thinking to you, our audience. And thank you to all our audience for your support, your comments, your share outs. It really means a lot to us, and we really greatly appreciate it. On that note, Merv, thank you so much again for all the work that you and your organization do and taking the time to share your insights with us. Thank you.
John, it's such a pleasure. Everyone like, subscribe, follow, all the things so John could bring me back.